From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We start today in Washington and with the Omicron variant, which is the big news of the week, I dare say. We've had a lot of news, and we're about to get more news out of President Biden as he lays out about an hour and 40 minutes from now his plans for dealing with this variant. And for that, we turn to our Washington correspondent. He is, of course, Mr. Joe Matthew, who is the host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, thanks so much for being with us. What do we know about what the president's going to say?
Well, this is the White House, David, acutely aware of how fluid this whole situation is. As we've been reporting, it's going to be at least another couple of weeks before we get hard data on this new variant. And I just came from a briefing with Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who repeatedly said that everything is on the table in dealing with this new variant, including, by the way, domestic travel. Now, we are not expected to hear about that today. The president is, though, going to speak about a couple of new measures that's being implemented, some of which we've talked about, including increased testing for people who are coming into the country from overseas. They'll be required to show a negative test result within a day of flying. There could be a follow-on test after they arrive. Masking is another part of this, extending the federal mask mandate. That includes things like trains and planes, public spaces on federal property. And then there's the matter of at-home testing. The president today will call on private insurers, David, to cover the cost of at-home tests. A lot of questions about that in the briefing. It'll be curious to learn more from the president exactly about how that is going to work. But whether it's the variant here, David, or on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, where we're still waiting for details on a vote on a continuing resolution to fund the government, never mind find some resolution on the debt ceiling, this president today finds himself once again stepping in front of the American people to speak in what is essentially a vacuum of information, David.
Joe, just one follow-up on this. Testing, masking, I understand all that. What about any possibility of curtailing our activity? We saw it happen in Germany today. Japan really went quite a ways, and then they backed off it. Is there any suggestion they may be asking us not to go out some places?
We haven't heard that yet, and there were many questions about that in the White House press briefing, hence the everything is on the table answer. David, they're really waiting to get data in 2 to 3 weeks' time before they dig in on this. It may be sometime in January before we get some more concerted direction from the president on how to deal with this variant. Of course, everyone is hoping that it is not as deadly as the Delta variant, and maybe some of those measures you're suggesting, David, may not be needed.
Yes, sometime in January. That makes for a long holiday season, I must say. Thank you so much to Sound On host Joe Matthew. You can hear him every single day at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. The discovery of the Omicron variant hit the United States hard, but it also has potential geopolitical consequences around the globe. To take us through those, we welcome now Ian Bremmer. He's founder and president of Eurasia Group and of G0 Media. So, Ian, thanks for being back with us. Give us your take on what this means geopolitically, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, in the United States, or in Africa.
Well, we've learned no lessons in how to respond to a pandemic since Delta's hit, which is part of the reason this is such a challenge. Inequality is only accelerating, and that means both within countries and also globally. It's one of the reasons South Africa is so annoyed about the immediate responses to them being transparent and doing a lot of testing around the cases that they have. But from a geopolitical perspective, I mean, there are a couple things that this tells us. Number one, China's ability to move away from their zero COVID policies is zero. They are going to have challenges with the Olympics as it stands. They're going to need their vaccines, as you know, weren't working well against Delta variant. That'll certainly expand as a problem when we talk about Omicron. And that means more supply chain challenges, more inward focus for the Chinese government. The Europeans are able to focus more on lockdowns and indeed more on vaccine mandates. And you saw that from the German chancellor. You saw that from the EU Commission president over the last 24 hours. But the Americans have no ability to do that at all because the response has become so politicized. And President Biden is one of the leaders most vulnerable as we move towards midterm elections, precisely because he's going to have to be dealing with, in a more expanded fashion, COVID, one of the few things he was polling relatively well on in the first months of his presidency.
So one of the issues is, as you described, the inequality in the distribution of this vaccine, which certainly gets illustrated when you come to Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but Southern Africa. At the same time, we had Albert Bourla on, the head of Pfizer, and he said, at this point, South Africa's asked us not to ship any more doses of the Pfizer vaccine because we don't have a way of getting into arms. What about the distribution system in some of these countries?
Oh, it's horrible. So of the 8 countries in Africa that the United States has put travel restrictions on, 5 of them have actually refused vaccine exports from the West in the past weeks because literally they're worried that their existing vaccine stockpiles are going to spoil. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first is because their infrastructure is poor, and so they don't have the ability to distribute the vaccines to the people in the country that need to get them. And the second is that vaccine hesitancy in these Southern African countries is very high. So the problem is so far beyond just one of getting vaccines rolled out. And as you know, David, all of that means that we have incredibly fertile ground for more and more variants to emerge. We've known this. Everyone has been saying this for 2 years, that if we're not able to get everyone vaccinated, it doesn't matter what you do in your individual country. We're going to see more variants. Here we are.
So, Ian, let me go back to something you mentioned about the Olympics that are, I think, something like 6 weeks away now in China. How on earth can China have an Olympics, a Winter Olympics, or are they just going to have to delay that or even cancel it?
If any country in the world of scale could have the Olympics, it would be China because they have an extremely strong surveillance system and they're able to quarantine for weeks. It's repressive. It hurts society, but it also means very, very few cases and they can track them. I mean, you may have seen in Disneyland in Shanghai a few weeks ago, they had one person that came in that was in contact with someone who had COVID. They shut down the entire park. They tested over 20,000 guests, kept them there all day, and turned out they all tested negative. If you've got a country that's able and willing to do that, and the inconvenience of the guests be damned, you can do that with the Olympics. But look, even given that, there's a heightened possibility they're going to have to delay or cancel. Even given that, look, the smart thing at the very least for the Chinese government to do would be to say that we are not going to allow anyone in that isn't an athlete. And that means no foreign officials, no dignitaries, which, by the way, has the additional benefit of allowing the Biden administration and others not to bother with the difficult decision of whether or not they'll implement a diplomatic boycott. If no government officials can come in because of the new variant, you don't have to say anything about a diplomatic boycott. And that is the solution everyone would like to have.
So, I want to turn to a different part of the world, as it were,
Sure.
And that is Ukraine, Russia, U.S. As you know, we had our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, meet today with Mr. Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. And they suggested maybe that Mr. Putin might be talking with President Biden. Tell us about your assessment of what's going on the border between Russia and Ukraine right now.
Well, the Russians have increased both their troops as well as troop movements on the Ukrainian border. That is giving Western capitals a great deal of concern. Furthermore, Putin is probably in his best geopolitical position since they invaded Ukraine back in 2014. Energy prices are high. Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that allows the Russians to deliver gas to Europe and not go through Ukraine, is completed. Angela Merkel, who was the person that individually led the process on Minsk to try to maintain stability in Ukraine, feels responsible for it. She's leaving. Olaf Scholz is becoming the chancellor of Germany. All of those things make Putin feel like he has more leverage to push the West. And by the way, in the same way that we think of Iran as being a threshold nuclear country only 4 weeks away from potentially having breakout nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapon capabilities, Russia sees Ukraine as a threshold NATO state. More NATO training of troops on the ground, more NATO exercises. And that is a red line for Putin. So at the very least, he wants to send a strong message to the United States and Europe at a time that he actually has a lot more influence, that he will not tolerate more integration of a hostile, from his perspective, Ukrainian regime into and with NATO. Because once they're into NATO, all bets are off for the Russians. They can't push them around as effectively. That's really what's going on here. It's not about Russia going to take over more of Ukraine, which would be expensive, very unpopular, and also lead to very painful snap economic sanctions from the West. But this is a significant escalation from the Russians, and from the Kremlin perspective, a response to the Ukrainians and the West pushing the Russians hard.
So, Ian, let's continue our tour here and end up in Turkey, because Turkey is a subject of great interest to people at Bloomberg right now, people who watch us, people around the terminal, because of what happened there with the finance minister leaving. Some people thought he was the last best hope of some more stable approach. Tell me what's going on with Turkey there.
He wasn't a last best hope. He had no independence. He had no ability to drive policy. President Erdogan is driving a much more unorthodox set of economic policies. It's leading a lot of currency to flee the country. It is likely to lead to soft capital controls in the near term. We already see quotas and limitations on sales of basic goods in stores. Of course, the lira is getting hammered every day. Inflation rates are going up. And from a geopolitical perspective, the possibility that Erdogan, under a lot of domestic pressure with his party and his own popularity towards record lows, much more likely to become risk acceptant in adventurism outside of Turkey. When we think about the role of the Turkish military in Syria, think about the role of them supporting Azerbaijan vis-a-vis Armenia, even over Cyprus with the Greeks. There are a lot of places where they can cause trouble going forward. Now, it would not surprise me if one or two of those become problems, greater problems in the near term.
And I suspect, Ian, that might be driven apart by how much economic pain the people of Turkey are feeling. The more pain there is, the more likely it is often that leaders will take action. What is the economic situation in Turkey? How bad is it?
Yeah, they're deeply unhappy, and that's coming at the same time as they're going to be facing the same kind of challenges from Omicron as the rest of Europe. And there is very little economic capacity to respond effectively. And of course, if you have to close the borders again, tourism is a big part of the Turkish economy too, and that's going to take a huge hit. So, I mean, the United States, Europe, I mean, the wealthier countries are countries that at the very least were able to really alleviate extreme poverty through the last waves of COVID because we have that money. We have those reserves. The Turks increasingly don't have that opportunity. Their indebtedness is growing. Their ability to grab secure additional credit is becoming more constrained. Erdogan's in a corner. He doesn't like that.
Ian, always great to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Ian Bremmer. He's the president of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Coming up, a status report on the supply chain and whether administration efforts are making a difference with Bindia Vakil of Resilink. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Ed Ludlow. Ed?
David, Minnesota's health department says it has confirmed its first case of the Omicron variant. The person had recently traveled to New York City. Officials say they were vaccinated and developed mild symptoms on November 22nd, which are now resolved. Yesterday, the first U.S. case of the variant was confirmed in California. Germany imposed stringent nationwide restrictions on unvaccinated people, limiting attendance at soccer games and other public events. Angela Merkel held talks with her incoming successor, Olaf Scholz, and Germany's 16 regional premiers today. They agreed on new curbs, including allowing only people who are vaccinated or recovered into restaurants, theatres and non-essential stores. The officials also backed a plan to make COVID shots compulsory. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned of serious consequences if Russia makes a military move on Ukraine. He says President Biden will speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, in the near future.
The United States remains unwavering in our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its independence. We discussed Ukraine's commitment to implementing the Minsk agreements, which we believe represent the best avenue for a diplomatic resolution to this crisis, potential crisis.
Blinken met with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov today in Stockholm. The Kremlin says it sees a growing risk that Ukraine may attack Russian-backed separatists there. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ed Ludlow. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ed Ludlow. In between the fight against Omicron and concerns over inflation, President Biden has found some time to focus on continuing issues with the supply chain as well, meeting with CEOs and laying out what his administration is doing to make things better. For a read on whether any of it is working, we welcome now Bindia Vakil. She is Resolink chairman, co-founder and CEO. So Bindia, great to have you back with us. Give us a status report, as it were, of the supply chain. Is it getting better?
We are continuing to see issues in the supply chain. Lots of commodity pricing continue to stay up. When I came here a few weeks ago, we had 19 commodities with inflation. Right now, it's down to about 15 out of the 30 that Resolink tracks on an ongoing basis. But still, earnings are also, we're starting to see the impact of supply chain on earnings season already. A lot of companies reporting profit impact, continued issues around picking up cargo, truck driver shortage still an issue. So unfortunately, not quite relief, not quite in sight yet.
Well, let's talk about what the administration has been advocating. They, of course, advocated 24/7 operation of some of the ports in Southern California. Has that made a difference?
Unfortunately, the supply chain doesn't. You have to have the entire flow get fixed. So yes, the port, we definitely see the ships getting unloaded, but we still have the truck driver issues. We still have rail cars not quite there. So there's a huge pileup at the ports. And so that's causing the next wave of the problem. So getting those containers moved.
Hello, Bindia, can you hear me? I think we may have lost Bindia Vakil.
Sorry.
Oh, there she came back. Okay, keep going, Bindia. I'm glad we got you back.
I was just saying that the port backlog is still continuing. It's just that from the ships getting delayed, now that container pileup is on the port, waiting for companies to take those containers out.
So if the 24/7 didn't really fix the problem, what about information? Because another thing we hear from the administration is we just need to share information more effectively. Is that a significant part of the problem? Is more efficient sharing of information going to help the problem?
Supply chain transparency has always been a major issue between supply chain partners across the board. I think this is the opportunity with the pandemic and with all the continuing problems, is that there's greater and greater push for information sharing, better collaboration between companies, not only with their direct suppliers, but their suppliers as well. And we're starting to see those changes trickle down. I think we saw this trend improve in 2021, but I think it's going to be snowballing into a major mega trend in 2022 onwards.
And Bindia, we heard actually from various people, including Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed this week, suggesting that maybe the Omicron variant may complicate even still further the supply chain, might actually constrain some of it. Do you have any early assessment of what that could mean?
Absolutely. The Omicron variant makes it incredibly complicated because as a globe, we are not coordinated in our response. Each nation has its own policy. We have not come up with a global standard for what is allowed, what vaccines we accept, what rules there are. So we're continuing to see backlogs in different countries at ports, cargo still getting held up, ocean containers and ocean freighters, the crew over there still experiencing the same delays that we have been seeing and talking about between which vaccine they need to have in order to be allowed into the country. So there's a huge morale issue in general on the crews, on all the ocean freighters. It's just a mess.
Well, that seems like a fair summary. It's just a mess. But let me ask you whether time alone may cure some of the mess, because we have these problems with the supply chain. At the same time, a lot of people are trying to buy a lot of stuff for the holidays. Once we get past the holidays, could that actually bring some relief for the supply chain?
Certainly, we should see the holiday crunch go down. I think the earnings season, I think the big worry is, will demand suddenly drop as a result of earnings or anything? As of now, that if demand shows no sign of stopping, which is great. It does mean that we live in a continued state of supply chain issues. Unfortunately, when you have supply chain issues and a strong demand, there's a lot of lost opportunity for companies who could have made record revenues and record profits. The supply chain is holding us back. So good news, bad news story there.
Okay, Bendia, it's always great to have you on to explain the supply chain to us. That's Bendia Vakil. She's Resolink chairman, co-founder, and CEO. Coming up here, Boeing is our stock of the hour, up on good news out of China. That's coming next, and this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The markets have had something of a roller coaster ride this week, I think it's fair to say. And here to bring us up to speed on where we are right now is our TV and radio markets correspondent, Kriti Gupta. So welcome, Kriti. Great to have you here. Where are we today?
Well, you know, it's another roller coaster ride, but you can't really tell from the surface level, right? Because you are having all three indexes in the green right now. And a lot of that just has to do with some of those consumer discretionary stocks, your Amazons, your Teslas. They're rebounding a little bit. But you also have, of course, Boeing driving some of those gains. But I think a lot of the action is in the oil market. And that's where you were starting to see that volatility earlier this morning after Russia said they're actually looking at an output hike, pressuring oil prices some more. And then they came back to where they were before.
But the markets, I feel sorry for a little bit because you have Omicron on the one hand, you've got inflation and possible tightening on the other, and then you've got OPEC plus. They got an awful lot of forces pushing in different directions.
Right, and investors just don't know what to do. And the common thread here is that volatility is just getting higher and higher. In fact, over the past couple of sessions, we hit a 32 handle on the VIX, the highest going all the way back since January when we had that meme stock mania, of course. So once again, we really are caught between what do you do, a variant, that 2020 pandemic trade, or moving forward to the future, the 2022 targeting inflation, Fed is hiking. Not sure.
Well, looking at the future, let's talk about Boeing. You mentioned it, actually. Boeing, I guess, is having a rather good day.
They are. They're hitting whatever the upside word of a triple whammy is. They're having a really good day. In that first, they're actually getting one step closer to getting ungrounded. Their 737 MAX over in China. So you do have that. I believe it's called a airworthiness directive, which is a very specific phrase that they use. So like I said, one step closer. They're also discussing new planes for Jet Airways, which is a Indian airline that has actually just recovered from bankruptcy, and they are building things out in a big way. And on top of that, you have some pretty good news coming out of their engine supplier, Safran, which is saying there's more demand for engines, which means there must be more demand for travel.
What about the aviation industry overall? I mean, they got hit, I'm sure, by Omicron. Is it coming back some?
Yeah, well, they actually kind of been trading sideways all year long, so they really needed that extra boost. And when they finally got it, David, the variant news came out, and they've been really just sliding and taking that big tumble, which is why, in that context, this Boeing move is all the more important.
Great to have you with us, Kriti. Great job. That's Kriti Gupta. Coming up, Senator Shelley Capito, Republican of West Virginia, on keeping the government open and breaking the logjam on Capitol Hill. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. One of the big subjects this week has been inflation and what the Fed response is likely to be. Should the Fed be accelerating its timetable for tapering its bond buying? Well, Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester weighed on this very subject just yesterday with Daybreak Asia, and this is what she had to say about the taper timetable.
Going into the September meeting, I thought there was a strong case for tapering at a faster pace than what we had actually announced. And since that time, the data have come in supportive of that case. So I'm very open to considering a faster pace of tapering.
Quick follow on being open to the taper. Many economists suggest the Fed should double the size of the taper so it can wrap it up by March instead of June. Would you be in favor of this?
Well, we're going to have to discuss that, I'm sure, at what the appropriate pace is. But, anything that purchases in the first, quarter or maybe early in the second quarter, right now, I would support that, given what we know about the economy. We'll know in 2 weeks more about Omicron, and then we can talk about what the appropriate pace is. But right now, I would support that.
How close are you? What do you need to see then? I mean, are you like, well, I just need a little confirmation to make sure I'm making the right decision? Is there something you're really doubtful about making the case and actually say, yes, go ahead to do that speeded up taper?
No, I mean, the momentum in the economy is clear. I mean, we've seen very strong labor markets. We've seen very strong price pressures and high inflation rates. I think the new issue is the risk of Omicron. And frankly, we just don't have enough information yet. I haven't changed my outlook. I mean, the economy is going to be, it's just coming in very strong. The momentum in the economy is coming in very strong. And if the Omicron variant turns out to be like Delta, one thing we've learned over time is that with each new variant, there is some, diminution in activity, that's sure. But each time it's less because the economy has learned and households and businesses have learned how to cope with the uptick in cases and the downtick. And, we've had a higher vaccination rate over time as well. So it really is going to depend on how, what the real risk is there.
That was Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's Kathleen Hayes just yesterday. Well, some of the concerns about inflation have been expressed up on Capitol Hill by senators this week. And so now we turn to one of those senators. That's Republican Senator Shelley Capito of West Virginia. Senator, thank you so much for being back with us. Where are you on inflation? How concerned are you? Maybe more important, how concerned are your constituents?
Oh, our constituents are very concerned when they see prices at the gas pump going up by over $1 a gallon. It's starting to get cold. People are going to see their heating bills. They anticipate to go up over 50%. I mean, that really hits West Virginians and all Americans right in the pocketbook. And when you go to the grocery store, you see the price of milk and other commodities going up. It's just, I think, very, very, very worrisome, particularly to those folks on fixed incomes or for those who are really sort of at the lower end that has struggled every month to meet those obligations.
How much of it is monetary policy? How much is fiscal? And I guess it's a way of asking, should they be speeding up the time for tapering the buying up at the Fed?
I think if that has the effect of lowering the pace and slowing the pace of inflation, absolutely that should be the way the Fed should be moving. But I think we've got other issues that are at play here. We're holding back our energy resources, the Biden administration is. We've got a supply chain crisis, which is raising the prices and also postponing the delivery of many, many goods and projects. Even these infrastructure projects are going to have trouble getting off the ground if they can't get the equipment to do the work. And I heard that as recently as last night that that's a real issue.
So let's turn to what's going on Capitol Hill right this moment. We've got a government funding issue that comes up, as I understand, at midnight on Friday. We don't have much time left. Are we going to shut down the government again?
I don't believe we're going to shut the government down. I totally disagree with that as any kind of strategic leverage. To me, it just is a fool's errand. And I think there's other ways to make your point. The point is that's trying to be made is that we disagree with the president's vaccine mandate. I agree with that. But we're going to have an opportunity next week to talk about that. I think we fund the government. We've got all kinds of things coming at people, not just the holidays. We've got Omicron. We've got all kinds of other worries. I think funding our government and whether you're going to get your Social Security check is not something we need to put on somebody's table right now.
Is one of the alternative ways to deal with it the so-called congressional review process? Are you in favor of using that?
Yes, I am. And that's what we're going to be doing next week. We're going to be saying that the president's mandate doesn't stand. We have 50 Republicans who have already joined in this effort. We just need one more vote. And we think that there are folks on the other side of the aisle who are hearing from their constituents that the vaccine mandate is considered unlawful, unproductive, and really economically harmful. We want people to get vaxxed, no doubt about it. But these mandates are, I think, proven to be problematic all across the country.
Funding the government is not the only thing that you all have in front of you before the holidays here. We also have the issue of Build Back Better that the Majority Leader, Mr. Schumer, says he wants to get through. I want to ask one specific question of you that refers actually to your fellow West Virginia senator, that is Joe Manchin, because he has come up and said on the child tax credit, he would be in favor of it if, number one, there's a requirement of work, and number two, is limited to people with income of $60,000 or less. Do you agree with your fellow West Virginian on that?
Well, I think what we have to look at is the whole thing in context with the child tax credit in there before. I obviously voted to expand that tax credit during certain periods of time, so it's that I wouldn't be necessarily opposed to it. But the bigger problem here, I think, that Senator Manchin hasn't talked about in those specific words is that they only have this costing out for several years, not the 10 years that this bill would actually be into effect. And once the government government says, we're going to raise your benefit, it's very hard to take it back. And if that, in fact, is true, we're into the $4 and $5 trillion of cost of all these programs that we really can't afford, shouldn't afford in this inflationary time or any time without having bipartisan discussions on it and where we want to go with it.
Is there any prospect at all of some version of the president's plan getting through this Congress?
Well, I've learned to say never here. So I would say that there are heavy negotiations going on. There is no prospect that any Republicans will join in this effort. I think that the physical infrastructure bill that we passed several weeks ago and signed into law was where our hearts are, where the soul and heart of America is, core infrastructure. And I don't think we're interested in running up these large, reckless spending bills and tax bills.
Let me also ask you about whether the Build Back Better is paid for. You mentioned one of the really big issues. We saw it out of the Penn-Wharton budget model, whether you take it over the entire 10 years or just take the first 4 or 5 years. But there's another issue as well that there was a lot of discussion on up on Capitol Hill this week, and that is increasing the assets available to the IRS to increase compliance of certain taxpayers. In general, put aside how many people it would be, how much money it would be, are you in favor of increasing compliance with the tax laws?
Here's where I think, and actually I was the appropriator for the IRS for several years. Here's where I think we can make improvements to the IRS that are much needed. They are operating on a very antiquated IT system. Let's up their IT. We do not need to have another tens of thousands of IRS agents looking into people who spend $600 or more in their bank account in order to get tax compliance. If you see the analysis of who that's going to hit and in what amounts, it doesn't go to these enormous amounts of money that the Democrats seem to think they're going to generate from this. I've never thought those numbers were correct, and I don't think I think we can improve IRS oversight by improving their IT, but I don't believe that we need to put more agents on the street to really harass small business owners and our taxpayers.
And finally, one last one. I mean, you've really worked to be bipartisan on various things, including with Joe Manchin and with others through the years. The debt ceiling, that has been in the past bipartisan. Both parties have gotten together and saying we're going to extend the time of the debt ceiling. Are you concerned that if in this time, in this place, the Republicans said, no way, no how, you got to do it on your own, Democrats, that will come back and bite you in future years?
I think that if you look at the discussions that are going on right now between Leader Schumer and Senator McConnell as the Republican leader, they're very quiet about the debt limit right now. I think they're working this out. I think the realization is that there has to be some buy-in on both sides of the aisle here. So I'm going to reserve comment and see how we're going to work that out. I have confidence in both of them to be able to reach a compromise for us so it can be done. Honestly, if I'd been the leader, I would have done it on the rescue package and had it, and called it a day because it's always anticipated. But that wasn't, he didn't ask for my advice, I'll say that.
Yeah, but in the television business, we call that a tease. That was a very good tease. So we're going to be watching to see whether there might be some compromise being worked out with all that silence up there. That's really helpful. Thank you so much. That's Senator Shelley Moore Capito, Republican of West Virginia. Coming up, defending the homeland from the Omicron variant with the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Biden is about to announce a series of steps the government is taking to maximize protections against the spread of the Omicron variant, including efforts at the border to keep the virus out of the country wherever we can. We welcome back now Michael Chertoff. He's former Secretary of Homeland Security. He is co-founder of the Chertoff Group. So, Michael, thank you so much for being back with us. I mean, you had responsibility for that border security. Give us a sense of the responsibility we're putting on the shoulders of people like at TSA and, for that matter, on our border with Mexico or border with Canada.
Well, I mean, I think that obviously there's going to be a new set of requirements. I think they've at least discussed the possibility of requiring testing within a day before you come into the United States. There'll, I think, be some checking at the border in terms of whether people have randomized testing or temperature or things of that sort. So there'll be an operational change that will have to go into effect. Now, this has happened before, and we've dealt with it. But, it takes always a little bit of a shakedown that's required to get everybody up to speed on the new protocols, to make sure they're properly equipped. And of course, at the land borders, you get a lot of pressure because there you've got a huge volume of people, and that means you've got a lot of additional folks you have to test or evaluate.
Well, talk about the land border just for a moment, Michael, because we do hear, I've heard on this program several times, and I must say often it's from Republican lawmakers saying part of the problem with the pandemic actually is that border with Mexico. There's a fair amount of disease coming across the border. Do we know if that's true?
I don't really know that that's true. I mean, it reminds me of people saying that, the border with Mexico is a vehicle for, or an avenue for a lot of terrorists to come in, which turned out not to be true. In fact, if we've gotten terrorists coming across the land border, it has typically been from Canada, not Mexico. So I think that gets swept up in politics. I don't think there's a particularly high level of disease coming through Mexico. But again, you have to look at all the borders, land, sea, and air, if you're going to take a comprehensive approach.
So, Michael, we're going to the holiday season. Obviously, unfortunately, we're going to be focused once again on COVID, and particularly this Omicron variant. But give us a sense of what other security risks that might be heightened during this holiday season.
Well, I think one of the risks, which will continue, is the risk in terms of cybersecurity. As more of us have worked remotely, we've been using our devices on the network. Many of those devices are not particularly well protected, and these become avenues for people to engage in cyber attacks. But beyond that, we've seen a dramatic increase in ransomware. We've seen attacks on healthcare systems, Colonial Pipeline, other kinds of critical infrastructure. And I have every reason to believe that may continue. And that's going to require a strategic change in terms of how we look at cybersecurity, both from the government and from the private sector. I know the government now is focusing on upping the game in terms of defending critical infrastructure. And I expect within very short order, we're going to see some additional new steps taken to make sure we are protecting ourselves against not only criminal groups, but frankly, geopolitical adversaries like Russia and Iran.
And we had that spate of incidents, including pipelines and things like that, a lot of ransomware attacks. They seem to have died down a good deal. Is that because we're doing a better job?
I don't think it's died down. Frankly, I think maybe they've paused a little bit. We are doing somewhat of a better job. I know the TSA, for example, put out rules with respect to pipelines that increase their cybersecurity capabilities. But I wouldn't count on this going away. And in fact, there was a story reported recently in the news about the Iranians attacking a major healthcare system in Israel. So this is going to be with us for some time. And particularly as matters heat up with Russia and Ukraine, we may wind up feeling some effects of that in terms of cyber disruption aimed at distracting the United States from being too engaged in what's going on in Europe.
Mr. Secretary, take us back into your old job for a moment, because there are various incidents. We had that terrible incident with the Waukesha Holiday Parade with the motorists who drove through the parade. We also have all of these apparently organized smash and grab, I don't know what you call it, thieves sort of breaking into stores in Northern California. At what point does that become a Homeland Security issue rather than simply a local law enforcement issue?
Well, I think certainly if you're dealing with an organized group, particularly one that's motivated by terrorism, it does become a Homeland Security issue. I don't know that the Wisconsin case was a terrorist issue. I think it may have been somebody involved in criminal activity fleeing and trying to distract. And these efforts to engage in smash and grab looting in California, again, seem mainly criminal. What I do think we see, though, is a phenomenon in which, as someone carries out, for example, a series of criminal acts, others watch it and they start to imitate it. And this is really a challenge for social media, whether these platforms are now becoming vehicles for inciting bad behavior on the part of those who watch it succeed and go, well, I'm going to do this too. And that means we're going to need to take a closer look at how do we work with social media to make sure they're not becoming incendiary tools in promoting criminality and violence.
Well, and you raised such an interesting point. I mean, obviously you were a lawyer, U.S. attorney, Court of Appeals judge in the Third Circuit. And as you know well in criminal law, conspiracies are worse than individuals acting. So some of this is the organization involving other people, whether it's internationally in a terrorist group or homegrown. Can you compare the risk of international terrorism with respect, as opposed to just homegrown terrorism that's organized?
Well, right now, we've actually done a good job over the last 20 years in protecting our country against international terrorists coming in from overseas or from another part of the world. And that's, again, a tribute to a lot of the very fine work done by the folks at the border. When you're dealing with homegrown terrorism, there's no border. It's right next door. And I think that's why we're seeing an increase in the homegrown terrorist acts, whether it's attacks on religious institutions or things in schools, inspired in many cases by the internet, but sometimes just self-generated. And that's much harder to deal with because it's low profile. There's usually not a lot of planning and communication. And the intelligence agencies are much more limited in their ability to examine intelligence domestically than is the case overseas, because we do have certain constitutional protections. And that's why the issue of homegrown terrorism and violence is going to require much more engagement by local law enforcement and even by local communities who have to be willing to speak up when they see a threat rising in the neighborhood.
If you see something, say something, I guess is what that is. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for being back with us. That is Michael Chertoff. He's former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security and author of Exploding Data, Reclaiming Our Cybersecurity in the Digital Age. Coming up, handicapping the list of candidates for the Fed Vice Chair for Supervision job. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Biden has said he will name his nominee for the key position of Fed Vice Chair for Supervision by sometime in mid-December. We're getting up to that time, and some very big names have now been floated. To go over the list, we welcome now our Washington Bureau Chief, Peggy Collins. So welcome, Peggy. Great to have you here. What are the names?
Well, you know what? Our colleague Nancy Cook reported yesterday with others on our team that some of the names in the mix are Richard Cordray, who formerly ran the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, current Fed president in Atlanta, Raphael Bostic, who also spoke today on Fed policy, and then Sarah Bloom Raskin, who has been a policymaker in the past. So three very established people who have backgrounds in policy and in finance, but also very different in terms of their approach. Bostic, very experienced, a lot of research in the past on housing. Cordray, certainly very experienced on consumer finance, so it will be interesting to see. But this position, the Vice Chair of Supervision, the top banking regulator at the Fed, is certainly one that Democrats really want to see a different person and approach on.
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren will have something to say about this, the senator from Massachusetts, without a doubt. To be sort of direct, why does somebody want this job? I mean, take Sarah Bloom Raskin. She's been a Fed governor. She was not a vice chair, she was a Fed governor. She was also a senior official in the Treasury Department. And even Raphael Bostic, he's Fed regional president. Why is this a promotion?
Well, I think it's in terms of your mandate, right, or the remit. You know, this is an incredible opportunity right now to oversee the banking system at a time when we could see things more financial risks start to come into the system. So over the past couple of years, certainly the fiscal stimulus and the monetary stimulus has really propped up this economy. But we're taking a turn now in terms of inflation really rearing its head and the Fed having to decide how quickly not only to pull back its bond purchases, but when to do the first interest rate hikes. That could have significant impacts on the financial risk in the system. And this person would be overseeing those risks and trying to stay in front of them. And then, of course, cryptocurrencies, big issue out there.
I was going to say a lot of it is what they expand into. Cryptocurrencies, and by the way, non-bank banks.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. Leverage in the system, and particularly the private credit area, is a big one that this person would also be really tasked with trying to oversee and monitor.
It's a big, important job. No question about it. Thank you so much to our Washington Bureau Chief. She is Peggy Collins. Coming up, we're going to have a second hour of Balance of Power over on radio. And in that second hour, we will hear from President Biden as he lays out his plan for fighting against the Omicron variant. And this is Bloomberg.